Between Civil War scenario. This is the What If Autist Civil War map. And is it possible? In his video, he said the red team would win, which is obvious because most of the red team is connected. Alaska and Hawaii are not included. Hawaii would be on the blue team, and Alaska would be on the red team, mostly as well. Most of the red team is mostly unified, with the blue team being mostly separate as well. Can the blue team survive? Okay. So we're doing a realistic scenario first. So a lot of these areas would be taken out very quickly. So the Cleveland, Buffalo, Detroit areas. Okay, these areas are by Canada. Canada can supply these three areas here for a little bit, but all these very landlocked areas will be defeated relatively quickly. This is because these landlocked areas do not really have access to the outside. The much larger areas, like in the south, could survive a little bit, but a lot of these landlocked areas will not survive. Colorado, a lot of southern New Mexico a lot of the New Mexico area would be captured relatively quickly. This is because this area is lightly populated. The first real push for the left-leaning would be capturing this area here, and they would capture a lot of these lesser populated rural areas, creating a large area here as well. Chicago would try to expand into more of these suburban areas, creating this area as a battleground as well. But Chicago would only go so far, as Chicago is mostly just funded by foreign people as well. The areas by Canada are basically just holding on because of Canada. Also, this part of Maine would be captured as well. And also this area here would be captured as well. So this Central Valley part of the Central Valley will also be captured here. Here, as California is one of the most populated states in the nation as well, and also this part of Arizona would likely be connected pretty quickly as well here. These coastal areas would probably receive foreign aid. For example, it took Israel like a couple months to completely take out Hamas, so it's gonna probably take a little bit longer for the Republicans to take out these areas. Washington State would probably survive the longest here, but Portland and the other part of Oregon would not survive that long. The invasion of inner North Carolina would continue as well here, and these southern areas would eventually be submitted as well. Now it's this Colorado area. Colorado has basically been turned into its own area. New Mexico isn't a very populated area of the U.S., so it would be taken out relatively quickly. Even like Albuquerque, it's not really the biggest city in the U.S. as well. Also, you would have, because there's a lack of like younger men in the Colorado front, this area would also be pushed back, also mostly due to lack of resources on the blue side. And the blue side over here would eventually surrender. Detroit and a lot of these cities would probably fall to anarchy, more than likely. This is probably because like Cleveland and Detroit would fall to anarchy. This area would probably be captured, so it would fight a guerrilla war for a little bit. The only problem would be fighting in New York and the Northeast. This area is a very liberal area and could connect, and the Northern Virginia would connect the rest of the country, saving this portion of the country from America as well. Also, Miami would eventually be captured as well. Miami has a lot of conservative parts of the area, which are mostly Cuban areas as well. Then we have the invasion then California would continue invading the very unpopulated parts of Arizona and Nevada. Yeah. Yeah. And California invading the northern portion here. Which leaves the western. And basically, they can blockade Chicago now. I don't see Chicago surviving that long now. Chicago does have a lot of population, but Chicago is completely reliant on the farmlands in the interior. Yeah. Yeah, which means Chicago would eventually surrender. Washington could depend on Canadian imports, but I think the northern part of Washington also probably eventually surrender as well. Well, and also fall into anarchy as well. Upstate New York would be captured, and we can see two possibilities. One is the U.S. splits into a national divorce, which means all the areas taken by the blue team becomes one country, and all areas taken by the red team is taken by the Republican country, setting a nuclear boundary between the two countries. Yeah. But the problem is, if the left basically still hopes they can win the war, well, it is sadly mistaken. These areas would be eventually taken out as well. And these areas, like the New Jersey area, would be eventually conquered. This area of Arizona, which is very unpopulated, that here, a lot of this area would be taken back. And what's to say, the left eventually loses the Civil War, and what if Otis scenario, map here. The last areas to probably surrender would be New York and California as well. This would be the ending as well. But what if the left did win? What if the left somehow managed to convince a certain amount of people? What if the left really won the Civil War? Is it possible? It is pretty unlikely, but I always like imagining what if the other side won. This area would be immediately captured. Third here, the left would probably try to start an offensive here to capture most of this part of Oregon. Again, a lot of the conservative area. The problem with the left is a lot of the left are not really built for combat. This area down here would be captured as well, would be defeated, and also this area up here in the Twin Cities here, and this part of Illinois would also be captured as well. Same thing with Atlanta here. There's no way stopping those places from losing in a conflict. Let's just say, like the American Civil War, there was a blockade, and basically, very similar to the First Civil War, there was a blockade basically preventing international trade to the red country. The red would see early victories as well, but the problem is the blue team here doesn't really have the resources. They don't really control most of the farmland, but in this unrealistic scenario, they take control of all of the East Coast, and they take control of the very sparsely populated parts of Arizona as well. Also, the black militias in the South continue to connect their army as well. I can still see Orlando falling as well, but the biggest front would be here, in the more unrealistic scenario. Yeah, well, the Northeast countries continues pushing in. Yeah, but where are they going to get the army, you would ask? In his scenario, he said most of the people aren't willing to fight for the nation, but again, they do have all of the people that were led in by Joe Biden. The leftist country can easily use those people, which are mostly around younger people, to use as army soldiers in this conflict. And because of how many people live in cities as well. Yeah. Eventually, they do wrap around the Midwest and liberate some of these areas here. Here. Here, and the conflict kind of looks like this. The black belt wraps around and connects itself towards the other areas of the left-leaning alliances. Yeah. Leon Miami would still eventually fall. This area in Florida is cut off. Which would be the small thing they would do. Yeah. They would also capture a majority of this area. Same thing with the very less populated here. This would be a battle of attrition. This wouldn't be an easy area to take, as a lot of the people here is armed. Taking this large area would be one of the deadliest parts of the war. But the right is basically losing in this very extremely unlikely scenario. And the right essentially surrenders and gives full control of the nation to the left. But again, this scenario is pretty unlikely, and I'll give you all the reasons why this scenario is very unlikely of the left winning, meaning the Civil War. Okay. Reason number 1. The right is more armed and more prepared for a war. Considering the fact that the right has more guns per capita, the top 10 states with guns per capita all are Republican states. Most gun advocates tend to vote for Republicans. This is pretty bad because most of the people they can use for basically the army are immigrants, which might quickly not want to fight for the liberal cause, and of course blacks. Those are the two major groups they would use for the army. Considering that most of the white liberals would not want to fight a war. Heck, they can't even survive an insult on Twitter. So, much kind of like the whole raspberry can't handle raspberry snots, much less Vegeta. The left can't even cries in the corner when they see a mean tweet on Twitter and demands them be cancelled. If they're fighting an actual war in the battle, most of these people are not going to fight. The people that are going to fight are going to be using the minority groups as well. And who knows how long they will do until they rebel. Because I wouldn't be surprised if minority groups start to rebel, especially African Americans and Hispanics start to rebel as well. Also, number 3, a lot of the farmland outside of California is typically controlled by conservatives, and the left in the cities, they need food. As shown by the farmers' protests in Europe, if whatever side the farmers side with, they are kind of screwed. Because if you have the farmers on the side of, let's say, the Republican government, the farmers don't have to supply the blue countries of food. And especially considering the fact that America is a net exporter, which means America exports more than it creates for its people. So America has enough food to feed itself. But if these blue areas are reliant on imports, let's just say from China, what if China has a conflict? What if Europe has a conflict? There's so much uncertainties, which means food security for most of the liberal areas would be massively horrible as well for these liberal areas, because especially in, for example, this part of the Dakotas, these small isolated areas, or a place like Detroit. Yes, Detroit could be reliant on Canada, But Canada also needs to feed its own people and feed other countries as well. They can't just, oh, we're gonna keep the Northeast and Detroit alive as long as possible. Same thing on Mexico. Countries usually put their own people first. Okay, the UN might be able to help with help with the left-wing countries, but as zone of Gaza, it is very hard to feed people in an active war zone, especially in these small places like Chicago and Detroit and these southern areas as well. And also, a lot of refugees would also go to Canada and the US. Mostly liberals would probably be the ones fleeing the most, because that would be most of where the conflict is. The left would probably be on a defensive war throughout most of the time, trying to keep control of the cities. But even people in the cities are not all liberal. There are a sizable amount of people in the cities that are conservative and vote for Republicans. So most likely the left is screwed in the scenario 80% of the time. There is a 20% chance the left could win, and that's why there's a veil, don't underestimate the cities in a civil war. But the cities really are the ones reliant on food. Okay, they're reliant on food, and they're reliant on imports from rural areas. And that's why when you always see in like a zombie apocalypse scenario or something, or when the power cuts off or something, the cities always are affected the worst. Okay, for example, where I live, a ex-urban area, where there's multiple large farms where I live, food security will be much less of a problem here where I live than in the city. If I lived in, for example, Minneapolis or Chicago, okay, well, if shit hits the fan, these places would struggle with food security, okay, as well. For example, UK and Japan, they don't really have a lot of places to farm. Japan and UK are mostly urban. They need imports. And the best example of this is Singapore. Okay, Singapore is reliant on food imports. Singapore cannot grow its own food. Okay, Singapore is reliant on imports from Malaysia and China for food. Okay, most cities are reliant on imports. That's a thing that is ignored in the Mersey season Civil War thing, is that these cities are reliant on imports. Okay, whoever controls the farms would win the Civil War. Also, the army typically tends to favor the right-leaning political party as well. And that's also pretty bad for the blue team. I don't know what the right-wing government would do afterwards, but probably would instrument a lot of these policies as well. Okay, I bet the war in America would be probably the deadliest war in American history. I wouldn't be surprised if up to around 5 million people die, which most of them are within urban areas. Yes, no surprise there, given the fact that they are here. So, for example, if someone just randomly just living in Tennessee, it's just a random civilian in Tennessee, they don't really have to worry all too much, unless they are drafted into the war, basically as well. Same thing if you live in like an ex-urban area. Yeah. Or if you live, let's just say, here, okay, you are not going to have to worry about here. The problem is, what if nuclear weapons are entered into the fray? Well, it gets worse because a lot of nuclear weapons are controlled by the Red Territory, which means they can easily just nuke each one of these cities as well. The next thing is, could foreign countries intervene? I think yes, but once their food security is shut off from the U.S., for example, they would have to rely on China for food, which is a deal that I think Europe wouldn't want to make. China would also suffer a lot, and the world would suffer a lot as well. I think that this is probably the most likely outcome. Once America goes into a civil war, people in Europe will also probably do a similar thing, and will basically enter an age of civil wars. Okay, people will say that's not likely to happen, but look at the past couple of years. You had a war in Ukraine, you had a war in Palestine, you had a war in Ethiopia, you had war escalate in Myanmar, you have escalations with China and Taiwan, North Korea and South Korea. You have escalations of civil war in Africa. You have escalations in even like European countries and America that the mainstream media doesn't really talk about. For example, there was a literal revolution of farmers in France, and the media didn't talk about it. So yeah, that's about this video here. Goodbye.